So we're going to graph these. Today's assignments in Delta Math, but you're all also going to have to graph them on paper or in Cami in a couple of days. The directions say to graph the function, then identify each characteristic, but truly, I shouldn't have written it that way. You need to identify those so that you can graph them. Okay, so these things are the same type of thing we were doing yesterday. So I should be able to look at that, know that my amplitude is 2, my frequency is 1. So what does that make the period? 2 pi, good. Vertical shift, I don't have one, so it's 0. So my midline is y equals 0. Then I'm going to draw a little parent function of cosine. Okay, and this is hugely important for this. Here's my little cosine. I have 5 anchor points on there. I'm going to draw in my midline. My midline is at y equals 0. So I'm going to go ahead and put that on there, even though it's on the axis. So I'm used to focusing on the midline all the time. So then I'm going to start with this point. On the parent function, that's 0, 1. Right now, we don't have any translations left or right. So the only thing that's going to affect whether or not that's 1 unit away from the midline is the amplitude. And the amplitude is 2. So instead of being at 0, 1, I'm at 0, 2. The next point I'm going to plot is this one. And this one goes at the end of the period. The period is 2 pi. And it's going to have the same y value as that first point. So I can go to 2 pi. I plot something with the same y value. Then this point's the next thing I do. It's halfway between those two. So that would be at pi. And I would be at -1 on here. So that means -2 here. Halfway between these two, I'd be at 0. So halfway between, I go to 0. Halfway between, I go to 0. Okay. Any questions at all? So those are the 5 anchor points that I need to plot first. And in Delta Math, you only have to do 5 of them, and then it's going to put, because it says exactly 1 cycle, and then it'll draw that for you. But then when we're doing it on paper and you actually have this grid, we have to go from -2 pi to 2 pi. So then I'm just repeating. So then this over here is at 2 pi, halfway between, I'm at -1, and then I get my zeros in there. And then you can sketch it in. Pay attention to the ends of the graph that they're pointing in the right direction. This is curving back down, so it needs to curve back down a little bit to have your arrow on it. Okay? What questions do you have? All right, so the scale on here, they're going to be the same on every single one of these. If this is at pi and this is at 2 pi, each little step on the x-axis is how much? What do you think? Pi over 4, very good. Because if this is pi, halfway between is pi halves, and then half again is pi fourths. So each little step is pi fourths. And when you do these in Delta Math, it's going to tell you you choose the scale. And by that, it does not mean pi fourths, like I'm counting by pi fourths. The way I'm not exactly sure, honestly, what they really mean by that, but what I did and what worked every time was I just put whatever the period was. So I would have put 2 pi, and then it lets me put that at the end, and then I can go from there. Okay, so that's what I would try doing first. That might be what they mean. It's just asked in a strange way where I don't feel like that's really it, but that's what works. So, all right, any questions at all? All right, number 2, what's the amplitude? 1. The frequency is 1. The period then is 2 pi. Vertical shift is 4. Midline y equals 4. So I draw a little sine parent function, right? Draw a little sine parent function. My midline is at y equals 4. That's my new x-axis. Okay, that's what I use as my x-axis now. So for the sine, because we're not shifting left or right yet, this is at 0, 0, or the midline 0. The only thing that's going to affect that is the midline. Like the amplitude wouldn't affect that, nothing. So this is my midline 0. Then I go to the end of the period, which in this case is at 2 pi. And I have another midline 0. Halfway between, I have a third one. There are my 3 zeros. Then halfway between these two, my amplitude is 1. It's still 1. So halfway between, I just go to 1. Halfway between these two, I go to -1. And these little parent functions may not seem super important yet, but that's because we really haven't changed much yet. So then I would just continue this over here. You continue what the pattern is. And sketch it in. What questions do you have? Anything? Okay. On number 3, go ahead and fill out the little chart on the right on your own. And make sure you agree with me. Remember that the period is 2 pi divided by whatever that frequency is, right? This is a sine function. So I'm going to draw my parent function for sine. Then I'm going to sketch in my midline, y equals -1. Okay, everybody with me? Yes, okay. So then I start here. This is a 0, 0. So this is my new 0, 0. This is at the end of the period. The period is only pi units long. So that point is here at pi. Then I go halfway in between to get this 0. So that's right here. And if you do these things in the same order every time, the more consistent you are, the better you are at not doing something weird and putting it in the wrong spot. Then I'm going to go halfway between these two. It's usually at 1, but my amplitude is 5/2, which is like 2.5. So I'd go halfway in between these, and then from the midline, I go up 1, 2.5. Halfway between these two, from the midline, I go down 1, 2.5. Those are my 5 anchor points that I then need to finish this. So you can do this in a few different ways. What I would do is probably do all the rest of my zeros because it's just on every other one. And then go and alternate above and below them. Uh-huh. What do you mean since the numbers are off? Which is like 2.5, right? Right, but it's from the midline. Yes. Okay. That's okay. I'm glad you asked because yeah. No, you're right. So that is 1. It's at 1.5, but it's 2.5 from the midline. So we always go midline's your new x-axis. All right. That's okay. I'm glad you asked. You got to ask to make sure you get it before we move on. Otherwise, you just sit there and then you're just confused the whole time and don't want that. Do your best to sketch it in. This is not an art class, but it also shouldn't look pointy because it's not pointy, it's curvy. Okay? And we should be hitting the points as well. Any questions at all? Okay. So hopefully filling out this stuff over here is pretty simple for you at this point. Our amplitude is 5, frequency is 1/2. What does that make the period? 4 pi, very good. vertical shift is 0, so your midline is y equals 0. This is cosine. So here's my cosine graph. All right, then my midline is at y equals 0. So this would be at 0, 1, and my midline and my axis are the same, but my amplitude is 5. So instead of at 0, 1, I'm at 0, 5. There. This point here is at the end of the period, which is at 4 pi, which in this case is off my graph. Now I get on delta math, you get to adjust that, but sometimes you're not going to get to adjust it, so we have to know what to do here. I can't graph 4 pi, and I'm not counting off my graph or anything. But because I have this and I can make sense of the rest of it, halfway between these two right here, this is 2 pi. And that would be a negative 1, or in this case, with my amplitude, I'd be here at negative 5. And then halfway between these two, I have a 0, which is at pi. And then I would need to double check to see if I could get the other 0 over here, but I can't. It's off the graph as well. So I can only get 3 of those 5 anchor points on the right-hand side between 0 and 2 pi, and that's fine. But then that is enough for me to understand what's happening with this graph, because then it's going to come back down, which means I can make this a 0 here, and this at negative 5, and I can still get the graph sketched in. It's just stretched out and stretched up. That's much easier to do with this to help you keep up with what's what. Okay. Questions? Anything? Okay. So number 5, amplitude is 2, frequency is 8/3. What does that make the period? 3 pi fourths, yeah. Makes it 6 pi eighths, which is 3 pi fourths. Because remember, it's the same as 2 pi times the reciprocal of that. And if you need to write it down so you don't do something weird, that's fine. It's 2 pi times the reciprocal, which is 3/8. And then that's what's going to give you 3 pi fourths for the period. All right, our vertical shift is 0. Midline is y equals 0. This is cosine. Sketch that in. My midline is at y equals 0. So I'm going to start with this point, which from the midline here would be at 0, 1, but my amplitude is 2, so I'm at 0, 2. This is the end of the period, which is at 3 pi fourths. Okay, so I already know that I'm counting by 4, so this is 1, 2, 3 pi fourths. That's the end of the period right there. Halfway between these two, I would be at negative 1, but then I have an amplitude of 2, so it's at negative 2, and it's halfway right there. Halfway between these two, I would be at 0. So halfway between these two, it gets a little weird, but not super weird. This is a unit and a half as far as, I mean, the pi numbers don't necessarily matter, but you went like a step and a half, right? So if I have $1.50, half of that is 75 cents. So I can go, half of that would be 3/4 of the way right here. And then coming from this direction, it would be 3/4. So it kind of hugs that line right there. So it's a little weird, but, and like I said, the pi numbers don't matter right here. But if I needed to figure them out, I could. It's not going to help me graph it, but I want you to think about this. If this is 3 pi fourths, what is this x value? If it's halfway. So y'all make this harder than it is. If I want half of this, I multiply it by half, it's 3 pi eighths. So then halfway between these two, what would that be? 3 pi over 16, right? It doesn't do me any good here, but if I needed those numbers, it's easy. It's easy to divide things in two, so don't make it harder than it is. All right, so then I would just continue this pattern. So I've got 2 spaces there, so I can do this one and then that one. At that point, at this point, you don't have to worry about like plotting things. You're just continuing the pattern. This is halfway there, halfway there. Okay. And then this here and here. Any questions about where any of that came from or how I knew what to do those things or anything? Good. I'll give you a second to finish it. If I don't give you enough time, because some of you can do this quickly, some of you take like 5 seconds for each point to make it look perfect. As long as you've got some of it plotted and you understand how to finish it, then we can move on. You can always come back and make your graph look perfect if you want to. I'm just not going to sit around and wait for everybody's to be perfect. Okay. So we're going to start number 6 together. Let's see. The amplitude 3/2. Frequency is 1, which means your period is 2 pi. Vertical shift is 3, so this is y equals 3. This is a sine graph. So there's my sine parent function. Then I want you to go ahead and work on this graph. Get this one graphed. I'll give you a minute to get started on that, and then I'll graph it, but don't just copy mine. Okay? I want you to actually graph it and of course, ask me questions if you have questions along the way. You have a question? What's your question? What's your amplitude just left? Oh, okay. And it's a little easier when your midline is farther away from the axis to remember that everything's going from the midline. But the closer the midline is, like if it's just at 1 or -1, sometimes you need to remind yourself you're going from the midline and not the axis so you don't count wrong, because you can confuse yourself in that. Okay. Any questions at all on number 6? Are we good? Go ahead. Uh-huh. Well, it kind of does. You can do it one of 2 ways. If when you do her question was the vertical shift doesn't have anything to do with what we're graphing. It does and it doesn't. Meaning that if I kind of ignore the midline, I can think this point's at 0, 0, right? So since it's at 0, 0, I shift up 1, 2, 3. But when you make the midline your new x-axis, the shift is taken care of. Does that make sense? And everything's already shifted and you just do everything else. Yes, and because we want to draw, it's kind of like what we did with the asymptotes too, same kind of thing. And so if we sketch this in, it makes graphing everything a lot easier because you're not translating so much. It's already done for you. That's a good question. All right, let's look at number 7. So our amplitude is 3, frequency is 1/3, so the period is what? 6 pi, very good. Our vertical shift is 1, midline, y equals 1. This is sine, looks like this. And then I'm going to draw in my midline, and remember, using the midline as my new x-axis just takes care of that vertical shift for me, so there's less I have to do, especially since we're not shifting left or right yet. So this is at 0, 0. My new 0, 0 is here. It's a midline 0, basically. The end of this is at 6 pi, which is not on my graph, and I'm not going to stretch out my graph there. So I go halfway. This is at 3 pi. Well, guess what? That's not on my graph either. So then halfway between those two, this is at 3 pi halves. Okay, does that make sense? I can do that one. So I can go to 3 pi halves, and if you think about the unit circle, before I even do anything here, you start at 0, you go to pi halves, then 3 pi halves, then 2 pi, right? So 3 pi halves is halfway between pi and 2 pi, and so I would normally be at 1. From the midline, since my amplitude is 3, I go up 1, 2, 3. And I can only get 2 of those 5 points on the right because it's so stretched out. But that's enough because I know that if this is coming like this, then it's going to go down here, and then so halfway between over here at negative 3 pi halves, from the midline, I would go down 1, 2, 3. And then that's the best I can do, and it's just a really stretched out graph. Okay. Any questions at all? Okay. All right, then I want you to do number 8. If you don't have any questions, just all of number 8. Oh, I'm sorry. This one, I don't know what the heck's going on here. That's not actually a minus. I forgot to tell you that. That might help. It's I don't know what happened. We'll make that times. Not even sure how I did that one. Once you're done with number 8, check yourself with me. Please ask me if you have any questions. And if you're good on number 8, go ahead and do number 9. Remember, don't just copy mine down. Do it yourself. Make sure that you have it correct. If you're confused about things, let me know. Okay. Any questions at all? And I know some of you aren't done. I'm going to leave it up there for a minute.